You might have missed this news story, but I heard it on the radio, and I've been logging it for a while. And I'd say you might have missed it because it happened in December, which is a month where we have a lot going on in all of our lives in that month, and we are trying to wrap things up in school and at work, and we're trying to get our houses ready for guests, or we're trying to get our house ready so we can leave to go someplace else and be somebody's guest. And it was a little story, but on December 16th, there was a story about this little rock that this little R2-D2 or like Wally unit had collected on Mars. And in this rock, they could see the channels where water had escaped from inside of it. And you would think, why do I care about a rock on a bigger rock a long ways from here that had evidence that some kind of water had been in it? Well, if you rewind back to last April, you would have found out that this little robot that we launched up there on some kind of rocket and threw at this planet Mars had dug a hole with a little auger that was on it, and through the frozen surface, which was all carbon dioxide, and continued to drill and found that underneath of that frozen carbon dioxide, because it's cold on Mars, I don't know if you know this, the average surface temperature on Mars is much colder than here, if you think it's cold. It's minus 63 Celsius on the surface of Mars most of the time, and I don't think we've quite gotten there here, ever. Close. I think I was out one of those days last year with this fellow from Canada, and he told me it was minus 30 Celsius that day, and I didn't know what that meant. I just knew it was really cold outside when we were actually shooting some video with him, and our camera was freezing up at the time. But on the surface of Mars, it's minus 63, and carbon dioxide freezes. And this little guy that was rolling around on the planet drilled a hole and found water, actual H2O, frozen water underneath of it. If you rewind back to last January, you would find out there was another story. You know what that story is about on Mars? Water. In fact, you would think that the only thing we care about on Mars is that there is water there, and we're looking for it. In fact, the last 15-year endeavor to Mars has been codenamed by NASA, Follow the Water. Now, you might think it odd that water is the most important thing. In fact, it is the most important thing for their mission. That they want to find water, and every time they find evidence of water, they put it in the news. And in fact, since the 1600s, when we've been looking at that neighborly planet of ours, the things that everybody imagines are water, because we could see these big polar ice caps on it, even with a telescope. And in the 1800s, a fella, he had crafted this great scheme, and you might have even heard of this, of the canals of Mars, that the Martians, who he envisioned lived there, had dug these big channels to get the ice from that polar ice caps into their cities that he imagined, which turned out there are no cities there. But we've been looking at this planet and taking pictures of it. If you go online this afternoon and look for delta regions of Mars, you will find all kinds of photos of places that look like river deltas that we've taken with satellite imagery. It seems like all the news about Mars is just about water. But it's not really about water, is it? Why do we care that we find water there? It's because we imagine that there might be some other life there too, and we know it cannot go on without water. Water is necessary for life. So if we can find water there, that gives us even the glimmer of hope that there might be something else in the universe living on a planet somewhere. Now, as you do know, is people will always respond, water is necessary for life, but water is not the evidence for life. You can't have life without water, but you can have water without life, which actually the planet Mars is proving to be quite a big proof of that fact. Because the more water we find, we keep finding water, and yet even things that we have thought from time to time might be the evidence of some kind of even microbial existence turn out to be actually more evidence of more water. Water is necessary, but water is not the evidence. And this is something that the ancient Hebrew writers intuit too in this passage that we hear this morning. Because, and don't want to get into whether God made everything out of nothing or not. And in fact, it's the doctrine of the church, but actually it's not proven by this passage anyway. There might be some others. But in Genesis 1, it clearly states there were two things there in the beginning. And one of them is the Spirit of God. And guess what the other one is? It's water. So water is necessary for life. It's not the evidence of it. And then there's the Spirit of God. And you can imagine that this is taking eons. Well, I can't be eon checked because we're going to talk about that in a second. But that Spirit of God is just hovering there with the water. It's though they are next to each other, but nothing has happened yet. But then something is going to happen because we know we need this water to live. But we know we need something else to make life. And so that next thing happens. And it's this. God says, let there be light. Now, I think at this point it's very interesting that light is there to dispel all of the darkness that is in this scene to this point. But it doesn't just come so that we can see things or so that things are not hidden any longer. The light actually has a purpose that the writer goes on to tell us, which is when it's light outside, it's daytime, and when it's dark outside, it's nighttime. That light doesn't come just to dispel darkness. That light comes to do something else, which is literally, in the writing of this epic poem here at the beginning of Genesis, it is the start of the ability to measure time. This is the kickoff for the story that will begin. It's when the clock starts running. All that preamble, all this hovering over the surface of the waters, nothing is happening yet. It takes God to do one other thing, to step in and say, we're going to start now, and now everything begins. And then the rest of the story is just markers of that time. Day 1, day 2, day 3. Getting to actually a day that has no night. Later on, day 7. That God, seeing the potential for life in this water, and God interacting with it, says, I am all in on life. And here is the moment when this story starts. It starts right here, right now. And I know the things that will happen in this story. In fact, you could imagine that God is trying to figure out what God is up to. Do I really want to start this thing going? Because I know when I do, a whole bunch of things are going to happen, and not all of them are good. I know that when I start the story of this race of people that live on this planet, some of that stuff's going to be bad. They're going to choose to rebel against me. They're going to choose to fight with one another. They're going to choose to do all kinds of hideous things to one another. And yet it's still that Spirit of God that's over the water who said, let's start now. And light started that time. And from that moment on, we keep measuring time the same way. There's day and there's night. And there's another day. I think this story is so important when we think about what happens to Jesus today, too. Mark wastes no time. The other gospel writers spend a little bit of time getting to this point in Jesus' ministry. Lots of other things happen. And in Matthew and Luke, we get this great stories about Jesus' birth and about the wise men coming, which we'll sing about later in Matthew. But in Mark, there's nothing else that happens before Jesus ends up in the water with the Spirit of God hovering over it. And when that voice speaks to Jesus from the torn apart sky, it is saying, this is when this story starts, for good, bad, or otherwise. And I'm all in, and you're all in. But it's even more important than that, and it's even more personal to us when we think about this ourselves, because water is necessary for life. It's not the evidence of life. But we all have come through water to be sitting here today. And in our own baptisms, there's water, and there's the Spirit of God, and we are sandwiched in between those two. And there is a moment in that ceremony when it starts, not ends. Nothing is accomplished in baptism. Everything is kicked off in baptism. And what's kicked off is sometimes good and sometimes bad, but it's all done as part of the creative process of what God is doing with all of us in the universe. Because if God can take this water in the creation story, which the writer tells us is formless, it's uninhabitable, there's no way anything could survive. And it's almost like us before we come and encounter Christ in our baptism. We are in such a state that though we do exist and though we are there, nothing could emerge from us. But after that moment of baptism, after that moment of speaking that you are my son, you are the beloved, now it gets real. Now it is on. Now you have become the very creative work of God in the world around you to transform it yourself. This is something that we do, knowing that there are going to be times when it's hard, knowing there are times when it'll be good, but knowing that there are times that we are leading towards something that is eternal. It's always fascinating that a creation story finally comes to a point with a day that doesn't have a morning and doesn't have an evening. If you ever want to, the biggest piece of evidence, if you're ever talking to somebody who thinks they want to tell you that this story is descriptive instead of prescriptive, just tell them, I know days 1 through 6 all had mornings and evenings, but day 7 doesn't have one. It's because day 7 is what the creative work is moving towards, which is rest. So when you're wondering what happened to you when you were baptized and God kicked you off on this great adventure, this great story that was begun, that would have chapters of grandeur and chapters of despair, time was being marched forward from that point. Know that you're moving towards a moment of rest and a place of rest. The baptism is about putting you on that road to rest. Just like those Spirit over those waters in creation, just like the Spirit that is over the River Jordan with Jesus. It's the same Spirit that was there when you were held between the waters below you and God's Spirit above you. And He announced you, beloved. And it started something that you could not hold back from. And that's great. And sometimes it's not so great. But we know where it ends. It ends in the eternal day of rest. Not the first day, but the ongoing day. The day in which we bask in God's glory and in His Spirit of Sabbath. Amen.
Amen.